Tato, and welcome to our webinar this evening. I'd just like to begin by introducing our two guest speakers. So we have with us Professor Suzy Edwards. She is Director of the Early Childhood Futures Research Programme at the Institute for Teacher Education and Learning Sciences in the Institute, Australian Catholic University, excuse me. And her group investigates young children's learning in the 21st century and includes a focus on play-based learning and on digital play. So thanks for joining us, Suzy.
Thank you.
We also have Professor Leon Straker. He is the John Curtin Distinguished Professor in the School of Physiotherapy and Exercise Science at Curtin University in Perth, Australia. He has a background in paediatric physiotherapy and human-computer interaction ergonomics. And he's been researching the physical implications of children using digital technologies for over 20 years now. So again, thanks for joining us, Leon.
Good evening, everyone.
So together, you guys have put together this amazing resource for Early Childhood Australia. It's called the Statement on Young Children and Digital Technologies, and I think we have a slide so that we can show you what this document looks like. The Statement on Young Children and Digital Technologies, and it provides heaps of practical guidance for teachers. So if you haven't, if you're not aware of this document, then it's a really good one. I highly recommend it, just for the range of practical guidance that it offers based on the available research in this area. So, Suzy, Leon, could you tell us very briefly just a little bit about how this statement was created, first of all?
Sure, thanks, Vicky. Hello, everyone who's watching this evening. I'm really happy to be here this evening, sharing some time with you and discussing the work that my colleague Leon and I, along with many other colleagues, developed working on this statement with Early Childhood Australia. So Early Childhood Australia is the peak representative body for early childhood education and care in our country, and it works with children, families and educators birth to 8. And Early Childhood Australia was increasingly aware that with young children, their families and their educators using digital technologies, network technologies and the internet more and more often in their daily lives, that a resource was required to help guide decision making about the use of digital technologies. And we talk about digital technologies, using digital technologies with children, technologies used by children, and technologies for young children, because technologies are often used on behalf of young children, for example, through digital documentation. And we were really interested in to identify what the literature had to say, what the research had to say, what the sector had to say, what children and families had to say about how we could be using digital technologies with, by and for in the best interests of young children. Great,
thank you. And I think there's another slide that you wanted to share. If we could go forward to the next slide.
Yeah, so this slide, I'll just run through this really quickly. This slide just shows the process that we went through in developing that statement. It was a very rigorous process. If you can see these little things called DPG, there's these DPGs all the way through, that refers to the Digital Policy Group. So the Digital Policy Group was the main group of people tasked with the job of seeing all of the consultation and research through to the end of actually having the statement written. And that Digital Policy Group had all sorts of different representatives on it. So it had people representing educators, people representing families. I think we had representation from the Office of E-Safety. So all sorts of people and organisations with an interest in this particular topic. So that group consulted with experts. So we consulted with people who had expertise in ethics in early childhood, in physical activity, and also we had some consultation from the paediatrician who's leading the National Child Health Poll in Australia. Conducted a systematic review of the literature. There was a very big conference that ECA held, the Livewires conference, where we had a lot of educator engagement. We did social media engagement. We conducted a national survey of the sector. We had focus group interviews with children. And all of that led us to the point where we were able to write a very engaging discussion paper about the sort of topics and information and ideas that we thought were probably going to be in the final statement. And that went out to the sector, and we had a lot of feedback on that coming in online, and it also went round to experts in the field, and it went to national peer review. And then our job was, and I still remember doing this with Leon, was to sit down and interpret all of that feedback and then work out what did we actually want to say in this statement, young children and digital technologies, and how we're going to make sure that what we had to say was really useful, engaging and accessible to educators as sort of was the primary audience, but also so that it would be useful for families and other people who are involved with young children and digital technologies. A process again of national and international peer review, and then finally ECA approved our final statement, and it was launched to great fanfare at the ECA National Conference.
Well, I think you did a great job. I've read the entire document and it's incredibly useful. So let's have a look at it. Do you want to talk through just briefly what, the different areas that are covered?
Yeah, I think Leon's going to take this one.
Sure. I can give you a brief overview of the document so you know that it's worthwhile heading to and having a look at it. And like Suzy was saying, you saw we had an awful lot of information from the literature and from the sector brought in. And so we tried to present this information in a way that was as concise as possible, but touching all the points that the sector thought was important. So in that introduction, we wanted to really give people coming from lots of different perspectives an idea about what we meant by a digital context, and get them to think about what their perspective was, what the perspective of the families that they'll be working with was as well, so they could really try to understand the information we were providing and apply it to their own context. What we got from the sector and the literature was that there were sort of four main areas of concern and interaction with young children and digital technologies. So we ended up structuring the document around those four areas, being relationships, covering child to child, child to adult relationships, health and well-being, covering a range of physical and mental and social well-being, issues to do with rights and citizenship, and then issues to do with play and pedagogy. And so within each of those sectors, we provide a concise review of what the evidence is, and some ideas about how educators could think about that evidence and use it in their decision making for what they do with, by and for children with digital technologies. And so we really tried to emphasise the professional responsibility of educators, that there wasn't a black and white, one size fits all sort of thing, do this, but here's the information about what's good and what works well, and apply this using your professional wisdom and the family context to make it appropriate for that child at that particular point in time, and make it work for them.
Okay, great. Okay, let's have a look at some of these areas in more detail. So, so the first area, relationships. I think many people are familiar with the idea that the argument that using technologies can be detrimental to social skills and social relationships. But are there ways did you discover in the research any ways in which technology can actually enhance relationship building and social interactions?
Thanks, Vicky, for that question. I think one of the things that can happen with a topic like young children and digital technologies is that it can become quite emotive, because, of course, as educators and parents of really young children, we want the absolute best for these little people who are in our care. And I think one of the things that can sometimes happen is that myths, or another one, I've heard this described in some of the reading that I've done around the topic, is what are called techno tales, little techno,
Right.
not tales as in the ones that you wag, but stories, like little techno stories. Techno tales can develop that people use to sort of respond to what can be something that they see as challenging or confusing. And I think that that idea that technologies ruin children's social relationships is a bit of a techno tale.
Okay.
So I don't think that there is any really definitive evidence that says using technologies ruins children's peer-to-peer relationships. What we did find was that co-use is really, really, really important when young children are involved in using technologies, and co-use includes peer-to-peer, so children using technologies together, and it also includes adults. So peer-to-peer technology use actually can create opportunities for children to talk with each other, to problem solve together, to test out ideas together. And co-use with adults is really important because adults can provide a lot of the sort of scaffolding that's required for either learning how to use particular devices or how to be safe online. But also it provides really rich opportunities for building language with children. So in the same way that we know that co-reading with children promotes opportunities for interactions that build language, so does co-using technologies with children. So that's one of the sort of ideas that we came across. And probably the other really significant idea that we grappled with in this relationship section of the document was the idea of adult technology use. So there's a lot of emphasis placed on, oh my gosh, you know, children are using technologies and, you know, maybe we should stop it or mediate it or moderate it or make sure they're all okay, but not as attention is directed towards how adults are using technologies, particularly children. And so one of the really important messages that came out of our work, and this is the one that picked up the most media attention actually, when the document was released. I remember there was one article in the newspaper around wrote about your kids' use. Maybe you should be wrote about your own.
Right, because we're role models for children, of course.
Exactly how we role modelling technology use. So if someone wants to talk to us about we're distracted by our phone and not making eye contact, what are we signalling to the children? What is important about the relationship? So that's that sort of thing where adults need to be aware that if someone's trying to engage with me, I need to put the technology down. So I think that was sort of the two main important ideas in this one. And you can see there the sort of practice advice that we developed. So very important are promoting the social interactions, learning to share, peer-to-peer, adult self-regulation, and then trying to build an understanding between families and educators and services about how technology use will occur by adults in front of children. And that fifth one in particular came out when we engaged with the sector. We heard a lot of concern from educators about parents coming in and talking on their phones or scrolling through their phones when it was for children to be dropped off at the service or collected from the service, and the sort of messaging that behaviour sends to children and staff. And so ways services can help create some common language and understandings around the appropriate modelling of technology.
Great idea, thank you. If we could turn then to the next slide, and we're looking now at digital technologies and health and well-being. Leon, can I direct some questions to you in regard to this area? So some researchers found that technology use can have a negative impact on physical activity levels. Is this the case in early childhood? And if it is, how can teachers mitigate that issue?
Yes, this is a concern that's widely expressed amongst health researchers and also amongst the community. And it's probably helped on by lots of the images you see when children and technology are presented. So it's usually a child sitting down with a tablet, a touchscreen device. Most of the research evidence that we found is actually from older technology, from TVs rather than the mobile touchscreen devices that we have now. And most of it was from older children, not from the younger group. So there's a real gap in good information about health implications in general, about touchscreen use and young children and the physical and mental health implications of that. Having said that, we know that physical activity is really important for growing children and adults, but particularly for young children. And so we know that that's important, and we know that children who spend too much time sitting and not enough time running around aren't building strong muscles and bones, aren't developing the motor coordination and skills that they need for keeping them active and mobile and healthy throughout their whole life. But perhaps one of the generational things for parents is that they've thought of technology as just screen technology, and they've thought of it as just as a TV in a way. That's what they grew up with. But in fact, current digital technologies offer a whole range of opportunities and potential stimulus for children to be physically active. So Suzy and I have been trying to work to help people sort of reframe how they think about digital technologies and thinking about how they can use these technologies to promote movement with children, rather than just thinking of them as the way that you sit a child down to look at a screen for a while. Now, from time to time, that may be an extremely appropriate thing to do. We all need to sit and rest during the day, so there's nothing wrong with sitting, but it's that balance about getting enough activity during the day and some sitting and recuperation during the day. So helping educators and families think about how you can use technology to actually stimulate children to be physically active in different ways. Just simple things like one child videoing another child doing a jump and then playing that back in slow motion so they can sort of learn how to do the skill and have fun engaging with the technology while they're actually being physically active.
Great ideas, thank you. Okay, if we turn to the next area, citizenship. Should early childhood settings be developing policies and practice guidelines for digital technology use? What sort of important considerations would these policies need to cover?
Thanks, Vicky. So this area, citizenship, directly addresses that notion around should services be starting to develop policies, thinking about the use of technologies in the way that they engage with children and families. And we would suggest that that's probably quite timely now. So what this area of the ECA statement looks at is the way that digital technologies, especially the internet now, is just a really fundamental part of society. It's central to how people communicate and conduct so many aspects of their lives. So, try and think about living your day-to-day life now without the internet, how you do your banking, how you do the shopping, can you touch on and off the train, would you be able to communicate with anyone, can you send a quick message to your a family member to say, take the washing off the line, or remember to buy some eggs for dinner, or anything. And children are part of this as well. There's so much information available to children and digital content and opportunities for children. And even at the level of the United Nations now, internet access is recognised as a fundamental human right. So that's a whole new concept for us to grapple with in early childhood education, that actually internet access should be considered a human right. And when I first read that myself, I sort of really grappled to get around that. I was thinking, is it really that fundamental that it should be human rights? So working from that point that the internet now is so central to everything that happens, if you think about your services, technology and the internet, even if the children are not directly using them, will be central to how you're running the service, the service and engaging with the families. So probably invoicing happens electronically.
Yeah.
Communication with families is probably happening electronically, possibly through email, but more and more and more through the digital documentation apps. So I don't want to use any names, but these are the apps that educators are using to take photographs or even video of children and provide commentary, and the parents and families can join the app and see what their children are doing in the service, and also and the use of these sort of technologies and devices and apps raises a whole lot of questions about where is all that information about children going? Is it stored directly on the device in your service? Is it going up to the cloud? If it's going up to the cloud, who's your service provider? Is it stored onshore or offshore? There's so many questions like who's got the right to access the data? Have the children been asked whether they grant their permission? Photographs taken and uploaded to these sort of things. Definitely timely for services to be thinking about what sort of policies they have around the use of technologies in their services. And just a little sort of aside from a personal perspective, my youngest little fellow, we have 4 children, so our youngest little fellow's just started school. Last year he was in an early childhood service, and the service had made a decision to use a digital documentation app, and it was going to be service-wide, and they sent home a permission form saying, can we have your permission, you know, to use this app? And then on the form it said this will be the only form of communication with families about activities that are happening in the centre. So I signed the form because otherwise I wouldn't have known what was happening in the centre. But I didn't actually want his images or information about him being uploaded to that system. So you can see how many ethical questions are sort of stirred up by just what seems on the surface a really simple use of technology.
Thank you, Suzy.
I don't know if you should be thanking me, Vicky. That's very
well. No, thank you for sharing the complications of it, and yes, making things more complex. But that's we like that. Let's have a look at the last slide then. Perhaps slightly less contentious. Using digital technologies to support children's play and exploration. I think this is possibly an area that teachers might feel more familiar with. Who would like to talk about this slide?
Oh, I think I'm doing this one.
Okay.
I have to see Leon do this one. Maybe one day he will.
I'm learning.
He's becoming a real expert. So this one was probably, you're right, it's not quite as contentious, and it's probably the one area that actually had the most available research for us.
Right. That's interesting.
And fundamentally, this one says we know the importance and value of play for young children's learning and development in early childhood education, and we understand how to draw on the principles of play-based learning to facilitate opportunities for really young children to use technologies. And I think there's 2 ideas that are interesting or important. The one is that learn how to use technologies through play. So just playing around, you know, just exploring with the technology. They'll test out everything it can do. What does this button do? If I turn this on, what happens if I click here?
And end up more skilled than us.
Well, yes and no. That's because we don't have that exploratory mindset so much. Like, more inclined to think, oh no, something might go wrong. Whereas I'm more prepared just to test it and learn with it. And so we know that epistemic exploratory activity is one of the ways that children will try to learn about anything in their world. It's the way they'll try and work out how does sand work. How does dry sand work? How does dry sand work when I tip it, when I pour it, when I dig it? What happens to sand when I add water? When I tip it and dig it and pour it. So children will do epistemically explore with sand. Children will epistemically explore with different technologies through play. So that's
this
one
should
way
be encouraged.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one way to think about digital play. The other way to think about digital play is how children use technologies once they've sort of done all the exploration and mastered what that technology can do, then they're in a position to actually use the technology in a way that means they can represent their understandings of what their world is all about. So that's when you might, you know, they might be able to take photos, create a slideshow, join a webinar with children from another centre to, share something that they've been doing together. And then the other aspect around digital play is to understand that for very young children, digital play doesn't always have to involve a working technology. And digital play can actually be the representation of technologies in their daily lives through their role play. So I'm sure probably everyone has seen a child just put their hand up and talk on the phone, or tap into a block to make a mobile phone. Or I've had a teacher describe to me how she had two children sit side by side next to each other with a rectangular block in their hands, one each, and they sat there happily together with just a pretend, not even a pretend screen, but they were happily chatting away and saying, you move that, you do that, you do that.
Wow.
So also understanding that digital play is the use of non-digital materials for reenacting or exploring digital lives.
Okay, cool. I know we've probably got teachers dying to ask some questions, so let me just open up the floor to teachers to start sending in those questions via the chat button. And Leon and Suzy, perhaps you could just share with us what's the follow-up to this work now.
Yeah, do you want to just click through the next slide?
There's one more slide, isn't there? Yeah.
Oh, Leon, do you want to speak? Can you go back to that other slide, back one? And maybe one more? That's it, this one here. Did you want to talk to this slide, Leon?
Well, just very briefly to sort of say what happened when we had the statement published and released, and you can see that we've made Early Childhood Australia had lots of hard copies and distributed it through their very broad network across Australia, and lots of online engagements with that, and it's getting picked up in other literature and cited there. And we'll also work through our industry sort of partners to try to get them to be looking at that, because we had industry partners involved in the digital policy group as we were developing it. And so part of the outcome of that is to try to have them involved in trying to use that, which leads us on to the question you're asking and on the next slide, sort of where we're going with that work now. And the first one is this one, which is a project that Suzy's leading. I'll let her talk about that, this one.
So this is a project based on the work that we did getting the statement over that, that 2 years that I showed you on the timeline. So we got to the point where it was published, and then we secured funding from the Australian Research Council to actually now take all those suggested, the practice advice in that statement, and try to work out how do educators, children and families use that practice advice, and whether any of the practice advice is relevant across the different areas. So if there's some practices that are happening around fostering peer-to-peer relationships, for example, does that actually have implications for how teachers plan digital play opportunities for children? So in that project, we're really looking at finding what are the really outstanding or exemplar practices that we can identify, and how can those practices help really important organisations such as we've got this Australian Broadcasting Corporation or the Australian Federal Police, organisations like that provided advice to families and educators about how to use technologies in a possible way with children.
That sounds interesting.
And then maybe just go to the last slide then, sort of for the other bit of work that we're doing. One of the things that came up in the build-up to the developing the statement was the real problem with professionals like early childhood educators getting mixed messages from health and education. So education was generally saying that this is a really important part and skill for children to be learning about digital technologies. And a lot of the messaging from health authorities is about screens and saying that screens are very bad for health and you shouldn't let any child near them because they're toxic. And so one of the things that is unique in what the statement did is that it brought together education perspective, which is embodied in Suzy, and sort of health perspective, which is why I was involved, and actually tried to bring these two areas together, because families don't want to have competing advice from different authorities. They need to have all the pictures together because they're dealing with a whole child, not a part of the child about education and a part of the child is about health, but it's about the whole child. And so that's how we developed the statement together, and why ECA actually had Suzy and I be co-chairs of that digital policy group, which was unique internationally. That's never happened before. They've only ever had education-focused things and health-focused things, and never had both groups in the same camp together. And I think that makes that statement so much more useful than separate sort of statements. And so to really build on that, one of the people in the digital policy group, Susan Danby, is a professor of early childhood in Brisbane. She's got together a group of people with expertise across that whole child domain, and we've got funding now from the Australian Research Council to have a 7-year program of research to really build up the evidence base. Just like we mentioned earlier, the evidence base for young children and contemporary technology is actually quite small. A lot of the research has been on older children, and it's on older technology, and isn't really relevant to contemporary families. And so this centre will look at young children specifically and contemporary technology specifically, and look at the health, education and social implications of the ways and practices that families have with that, to be a trusted go-to source like the statement has been, where educators and families can go and know they're getting good quality information. So I don't know what New Zealand media is like. I'm sure it's much better than Australian media, but Australian media just tends to have scare stories. So, and they're on both sides. Don't let your children touch the screen because they're going to die of diabetes. Or make sure your child is spending hours on a tablet every day, because otherwise they're going to miss out on the digital revolution. They're not going to be able to get a job in the future. So it's all this scare stuff. And really we want high quality, trustworthy information that professionals and families can use, like what we prepared in the statement, based on the evidence that was available a year ago. And this centre will keep feeding into updates of the statement into the future.
Great. It's great to see, a policy document, a practice document being brought to life through these extra projects that you're doing. So that's really interesting. We look forward to hearing more about them. Okay, questions coming in. Teachers are asking, do you recommend that early childhood centres purchase devices? And what kind of digital devices would you recommend?
Do you want me to take that one, Leon?
Sure.
Yeah, so I think that that's actually a question that's not so much about a device and which device should you purchase, but more a question about what is important to your service, what's your overarching educational philosophy in your service, how do you already understand children's learning, what are the practices you have around children's play and play-based learning, and answering those questions will help you make decisions about what sort of technologies you might like to use in your service. So if you just go, oh my gosh, all early childhood services now have iPads, we better buy iPads, then you won't have an existing foundation for which to integrate that use. But if your service has particular value on children's hands-on learning and problem solving and celebrating children's new learning with families, then you might decide that a good start to your service would be to get some little coding robots or pillars where children get to start just sort of using very simple directions like forward, backwards, left, right, start to code little robots and problem solving different sort of directions and all sorts of ways that they want the robots to go. And then you might decide just to really simply document that learning, maybe using an iPad, and that might just involve making a small movie or something like that, that then round about pick-up time, that iPad is put up where the parents sign the children in and out, and the little movie's playing. And so that as the parents come into the service to sign their children out, they see the little movie playing on the iPad of the coder pillars. they go and see their child and they're like, oh my gosh, did you use the coding today? You know, tell me all about it. And then the educator's there and able to say, oh, we problem solved this, we learnt that. So the emphasis is on what services value and what children are learning. It's not on rushing out to buy a whole lot of devices.
And I think we need to remember as well that sort of broad spectrum of what counts as digital play. You know, the thing that leaps to mind is computers and iPads and screen time. And, you know, obviously you've given us some really nice examples there of some very active hands-on learning with digital technologies.
Yeah, I did a study, just finished it this year, and it was on digital play, and several of the services that participated in that project had no access to any digital technologies, none. And yet the project was on digital play. And so some of the things that those services did was printed off a picture, a life-size picture of an iPad, laminated it, and then they engaged with the children and the families to find out what were the favourite apps that the children's and families used at home. And then they printed off the little apps and they laminated those and they put the little Velcro apps on the iPad, and they popped it in the home corner. And the play that emerged out of that was very deep and very rich, and the children were pulling the apps on and off and talking which ones they didn't have, and you know, they might be cooking a meal in the home corner and they're like, oh, we need to go into Safari to search for a recipe. And so that didn't even involve buying any technology at all.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it feeds into another question that's been asked about screen time, and perhaps Leon, you can share you know, some of the very contrasting evidence around screen time, but sort of this idea that maybe parents and teachers will be concerned about the amount of screen time, particularly if children are using screens at home. You mentioned before about having time to relax, and maybe relaxing in front of a screen at home. Should then the Early Childhood Centre be providing even more screen time? How have you found justifying it to parents and teachers?
Sure. Well, lots of families and educators are obviously concerned and interested. Everyone wants the best interests of children there.
Absolutely.
One of the problems with a lot of that research that is used by health professionals to argue against any sort of use of screens is that it considers time only, and that's probably not a particularly useful construct for most of the effects that digital interactions have. So whether you're video chatting with a family member or sitting with your parent, talking to another parent who's remote on a video, that's going to have much different sort of social influence on the child than if the child's sitting alone watching the same cartoons over and over again. So they may well have different sort of cognitive, education and social impacts. So time isn't a particularly useful construct, except for the amount of sitting time. But then if you're talking sitting time, it doesn't really matter whether they're using a digital technology or old-fashioned paper technology. So a child sitting and colouring in with a pencil and paper is still sitting down. And if that's all they did all day, they wouldn't develop strong muscles and bones, and so that wouldn't be good either. So I think it's better for families to be thinking about what's a appropriate activity for a child to be doing. So across the day, they're getting lots of activity and movement. They're getting lots of rich educational experiences. They're getting lots of social interactions with peers and families, and not think about, this is 30 minutes of a screen in front of them, but rather what's an appropriate activity for them to be doing in terms of their body and their mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask about limiting screen time, so thank you for bringing that up, and that's quite an interesting argument. I know my son spends a long time sitting reading books, and I don't think anyone would ever question that wasn't good for him, but of course he is sitting for a very long time too, so it's interesting.
The obesity and diabetes risk are going to be exactly the same reading a book from paper as reading a book from a screen. That's not going to influence the physiological risk at all.
That's interesting. So families are going to have a lot of different opinions, though, aren't they? They're not necessarily going to have been looking at the statement you guys have produced. So teachers have got quite a job, I think, in sort of meeting the needs of diverse families, diverse opinions about technology. Do you have any advice for how centres can go about ensuring that all parents are happy with the policy around digital use, digital technologies?
I think it's really important. I'm sorry, I've got sun happily shining through my window as the sun sets in Australia. So might look like I've got a bit of a halo. I think it's really important to remember that the education setting and the home setting, when children, those settings are geared towards different activities, and they have motivations in them. So at home, the child is the child in the family, and the family has many tasks that have to be done every day. So, you know, meals have to be prepared, has to be done, shopping has to be done. If there's older children, reading and homework has to be supported. Other, you know, children have to be taken off to activities. So there's a lot of things that have to happen in that setting, in which technologies can be quite valued by parents for the fact that they have those other tasks to get done. Mm. So I know myself that I will once my children are ready in the morning, I'll say to them, now you can have some device time, because I want to, you know, make sure breakfast is all cleaned up and, you know, bags are all organised and I'm ready myself before we go off to school. So the device usage is often serving a particular purpose. When that same child leaves home and then arrives in the education setting, the education setting is predicated around supporting that child's learning and development to the best possible ability of the educators. And so technology use in that setting is not like the way I might use it, where I need that window of opportunity for a task. The technology use will usually be orientated to. So if it is a screen time, it will usually be looking up something like how should we prepare the vegetable garden, or you know, who are some of the main characters in Shrek the movie, because the children have been role playing that a lot in the games, you know. So it's important to think about the dimensions of each setting and how the technology relates to what the purposes or motives of that setting are. And that would, you know, you wouldn't go to parents about that and explain it in quite such a complex way, but you might say to parents, of course we recognise that you might have concerns about screen time, because I do, because like, I agree with Leon, like you set out to freak us all out to say we're ruining kids. So first you acknowledge the concern, and then you might have some conversation with them around how do you use screens, you know, how do you use screens at home, so that you've got an understanding of what that might be at home. And then you can say, well, in our aim isn't so much to use it like that. We are trying to achieve X, Y, and Z. Does that make sense?
To really make that differentiation.
Yeah.
And if I can add to that, and probably sure. as a non-early child educator, I can say some things from the outside, is that for parents, they weren't brought up with a lot of this technology, and so they don't have their own experiences to fall back onto. They're really looking for trusted, knowledgeable advice, and early child educators are a source of that trusted advice for them. So I think there's a really critical role for early child educators to be working through with parents like Suzy just outlined, talk to them about their thoughts and ideas about it, and how the expertise of the educator in that setting can actually be useful for the parents, and giving some help and advice in helping parents understanding their own practices and how they can use them in wise ways with children.
Yeah, great. That's really great advice. Well, thank you so much. I feel like we've only just touched the iceberg of all the expertise that you guys have. But I thank you so much for challenging us. I've certainly sort of come to a space where I feel I can sort of reflect now and think a bit differently about things. And I like the idea that you're sort of saying to us that we can move away from these emotive arguments and really getting back down to the philosophy of what we're trying to achieve before looking at how technology might fit in with that or not was really useful for me. Is there anything that you would like to share with teachers as kind of a take-home point from the webinar before we close this evening?
Can I go first, Leon?
Sure.
Can you just go back to the slides, and I think it's the third last slide.
Coming up.
Just touching on that point, you know, that parents might not have access to the statement or read the statement. Maybe is it back another one? This one here. So on the, that's my left hand side. I don't know, I can't.
Right, it's on the right side still.
Bad at this. So on one side of the screen it says Statement on Children and Digital Technologies. So that's the full document with all of the literature and research and everything in it. But on the other side, with the little red circle, it says a summary.
Summary, right.
And this is a really cut down, accessible, short and easy to use version, which just says, here's the 4 main areas and here's some advice. And that summary will be very accessible to parents. So that's something that educators like point parents towards. Both the statement and the summary are so easy to find. You just Google online ECA Statement on Young Children Digital Technology, you can download it.
Yeah,
that's
great advice. Make sure everybody goes out and has a look at that.
Even if you look at the summary,
Yeah, I highly recommend it. Very easy to read and very interesting, and so much in there. Yeah, thank you, Suzy. Okay, Leon.
Final word from me. Well, just as I really think that educators have a really valuable place in society, and particularly in this area, and for young children to be helped, for those families to develop ways to use this technology in a way that helps them prepare to be a citizen in the world that they're living in, and actually helping the whole family to develop sort of ways that using technology that works well for the whole family is really important, and will set them up. In Australia, a lot of the media is about teenagers and the sort of mental and social problems related to digital technology use in teenagers, and a lot of that work, you know, a lot of those problems will be diminished if we have a good educational setting to teach young children how to be engaged in a digital world. They're not going to have the same difficulties as the current generation of teenagers who didn't have that as a young child.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. We know we have a really important job here in early childhood, and we're very grateful to people like yourselves for sharing and making knowledge so accessible. So thank you very much. I'm going to just invite our attendees tonight to continue to stay on with us if we'd like to have an informal chat about some of the ideas that have come up tonight. But I would just finish now by saying thank you again to Suzy and Leon for joining us and sharing this statement with us. Thank you.